This conversation that we intend to have this afternoon, which we're hoping is going to be one of the more interesting ones as we look at this week in the African economy, I think is a very apt one. Because if you imagine this meeting not being held in Ahmedabad in India, or Gandhinagar in India, if this meeting was being held in Nouakchott, or many parts of Africa, and you wanted to attend the conference, the whole week of the conference, chances are the only option that you have would be to fly in. And even flying in would be slightly difficult because you'd have to make very many connections from one country. If you're trying to make it from Rwanda, for example, to Chad, you'd probably have to take 2 or 3 flights to get to your destination. So Africa is in great need of infrastructure. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to hop into your car and drive onto a bus or get on a train and go from any part of Africa to any other part of Africa, get onto a train in Namibia and find yourself in Nigeria, hopefully a few hours later. But that's not the reality. But Africans have realized this. We've always known this. And because of this realization, what's happened is that there's been lots of investment in the last few years in infrastructure. And it's infrastructure of all kinds. It's infrastructure by way of railways, it's infrastructure by way of roads, infrastructure by way of airports, infrastructure by way of pipelines, infrastructure by way of power plants, all this to try and bring Africa not to a point of equilibrium, but just to bring Africa up from being many decades back to just a few years back. So there's a huge need for infrastructure development, and the bank has estimated that if you look at what's happening with our poor infrastructure, just what we're saying, trying to get goods or people from one place to the other, that has cost Africa, is continuing to cost Africa about a quarter of its production or its productivity, about a quarter of growth that we have actually had to give up because we don't have good infrastructure on the continent. So we do know that there's an infrastructure gap. We know that we need to do something about it. A lot is being done. Where the gap now is about financing it. Governments are fairly good with regard to speaking to other governments, but where the gap is still is where governments try and interact with the private sector. So private financing, banks, pension funds, and all the rest. And that's what we intend to cover this afternoon. For us, in this meeting, we don't want to talk about the problems. We know what the problem is. I cannot fly from Chad I cannot take a train from Chad to Nairobi. And so we know what that problem is. What we intend to find out is it possible for us to look forward in the next few months or years where governments are able to go and reach out to a private sector player, reach out to any other institution and get financing at good rates, get financing at good tenors to help Africa bridge this gap. So that's a conversation we intend to have. And it's a very nice panel that we have with us. We have Pierre Ghislain, who's a vice president for the private sector infrastructure and industrialization at the bank, at the Africa Development Bank. Janet Heckman, managing director for Southern and Eastern Mediterranean, otherwise known to you and I as the Middle East and North Africa, for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but she has got great experience in the private sector, which you'll be hearing about in just a few minutes. Jingdong Hua, who's the Vice President and Treasurer for the International Finance Corporation. I think we're all familiar with the IFC, which is part of the World Bank Group. Sergei Kuznetsov, who's the Director General and Legal Counsel of the New Development Bank. And you'll go, I have no idea who the New Development Bank is, but when I say the BRICS Bank, everyone goes, aha. So that's who he is. So Sergei is from the New Development Bank, but others known to us as the BRICS Bank. Charles Corbett, who's a Managing Director and Head of Financial Institutions for Sovereigns and Development Organizations, Financing Solutions Africa. His card is about this long because of that title, for Standard Chartered Bank. Adesegun Akin Olugbade, he's Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of the African Finance Corporation. And we also have Alain Ebobise, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Africa 50. So we will be hearing a lot about all these institutions, what they're doing on the continent and how they'll interface with this great need for infrastructure development and especially for infrastructure financing. So I'll proceed to sit down so that we can take the conversation from there. How we're going to do it is have a little conversation among ourselves here on the panel, but very quickly bring it back down to everyone, to you, the audience members, to try and take advantage of your experience. In case you have anything to add to this conversation, questions, or anything like that, we'll come to the floor and continue the conversation from there. So, can I be heard? Yes, I can. So my name is Wallace Kantai. I intend to simply be the person who asks the questions. But more to the point, I am an African and I'm seeing the great infrastructure needs that we have on the continent, and especially the one about financing. It has been a great area of great interest to me. But perhaps the person I want to begin with is Pierre, who's in some respects our host for this. And Pierre, you work in the bank, you've worked in all other institutions before. This interfacing between governments, the private sector financiers, why is it still problematic for Africa in this day and age? Everyone says Africa is a great place to do business, but there's still this gap. Finance ministers will tell you they're still having problems trying to get money.
Thank you, Wallace, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here for this discussion on financing infrastructure. Wallace already prefaced the topic. It's a huge challenge for Africa, significant needs. We know the needs, and we need to find a better way to bridge this gap, to fill this gap. One of the great things about the African Development Bank, and there are many, is that we happen to operate on both the public and the private sector sides. And that is exactly part of the challenges that we have, that your question touches on that, is how do we get governments to create the right environment where private sector can bring its capital, get a reasonable return, and then move on, or stay and operate the business. And so in most countries, we're not there yet. In most countries, we're not there yet. A lot remains to be done to create an environment where private sector is comfortable in investing in infrastructure. And clearly, infrastructures are long-term investments. You can't just invest in for a few years and hope to get your money back. So first, we need to keep working on creating that environment that includes things like establishing frameworks for private investment, for public-private partnerships, strengthening the regulatory framework also to ensure more security for the investors. Another approach that is absolutely critical, and that's where we, and you'll see a number of development banks on this panel, we bring a number of things. One is we have a set of financial products, and you'll hear the products we have, but they go from different types of loan to guarantee products to bond issuance, etc. So we have a rich panel of available tools that can help bridge this financing gap, but also we have shareholders who happen to be the governments that we are assisting. And that in itself provides a tremendous value, a tremendous benefit, because it gives comfort to investors. They know that if we come in, we are lenders to these projects in countries where the government itself, the country itself, is one of our shareholders. That symbiotic relationships provides comfort and guarantee in its own right. So at the African Development Bank, for us, financing infrastructure is a critical part of a number of our high fives. You've heard about our high fives, certainly if you've been here in previous meetings. One of them is Integrate Africa, absolutely critical. We need connectivity, we need road, rail. You spoke about air transport, which, it's quite. We had remarkable declarations, the decision of Yamoussoukro, which, if implemented, could really achieve a significantly and effective air transport system. Wallace described how painful it is to go from one city to the other. That is one of those areas where we need to combine the public sector side, getting governments to implement Yamoussoukro and respect their commitments, open up their air traffic to other African airlines, but then also where we can come in as financier and help finance airports, finance airlines, both of which we happen to do at the African Development Bank. So bringing these two sides together is really what we are trying to do, bringing governments to be more private sector and competition friendly, because competition is really what drives efficiency in infrastructure as in many other sectors, and then coming in with those financial products to help finance these, some of these projects and to help ease in the transition, provide comfort to private investors.
All right, thanks. Janet, maybe to you, and I was going to hold this off until later, but I think it's apt to ask it now. I want to take advantage of your experience. You worked at Citi for many years. We will not mention how many, we want people calculating. But you came from that into the EBRD, working right now, like we said, in the southern eastern Mediterranean region. But if you look at that in combination, what is it that makes it difficult for governments, especially African governments, to work with private banks, private finance institutions? What's a thing or things that can be used to unlock these kind of relationships to ensure that they can actually get into African infrastructure financing?
Sure. Thank you very much. First, for those of you who aren't familiar what EBRD is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And let me first say that the name is really a misnomer because it's owned by 67 governments. The largest shareholding is actually the G7 countries. So US is actually the largest shareholder, followed by Japan and then a number of the other European countries. But our latest shareholder is actually China. EBRD was set up essentially in 1991. What I like to say, it was set up really to privatize the former socialist countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So it's really very much a private sector focused organization. We entered North Africa in 2012 as part of a response from our shareholders, the governments for which we work with. And although we only really entered 4 years ago, we've already invested about 5 billion euros in the North African region. Really, over the next 20 years, there's about $1 to $1.5 trillion of investment that's necessary in emerging markets. And currently, about 2/3 of all infrastructure projects are financed by the public state entities. But this really can't continue. It's not a sustainable model going forward. Many of the countries in our region are currently under IMF programs or IMF agreements, and there are limitations as to really what can be guaranteed by the state or financed directly by the state. So it's absolutely critical that private sector solutions are sought and found. And this comes in several ways, and one of the things we really focus on at EBRD is working to commercialize public sector infrastructure entities. So these include projects like municipal infrastructure, wastewater, water, waste management, etc. We work with both the government and the companies in order to put in place the types of tariffs that are necessary to commercialize the companies, to teach them the modern commercial way of doing business, introducing energy efficiency saving projects. For example, one of the more interesting means of financing is for a company in Egypt, whereby we financed a private sector company providing water pumps, and they were paid from the government based on the savings that they generate in water. For the large locomotive project we're doing in Egypt, we're financing a significant purchase of locomotives, and we decided that probably the best way to assist in commercialization of the Egyptian state railways is to look at the freight aspect of that company and to do technical advisory on how to hive off the freight operations, which are the most commercial aspect of that company. So really a lot of the work is on finding innovative solutions for financing, number one, and number two, for working to commercialize these state-run enterprises so that they're commercially viable and eventually will bring in private sector investors into the companies. Procurement remains a key aspect, and that's one of the main ways that EBRD works to bring in the private sector. All the projects that we work with are fair and open tender, open to participants from any country.
All right, thanks, Janet. Before I get to you, Sergey, just to recognize the presence of the President, President Dishnaway, thank you for joining us. Sergey, I think it's, and I know you probably wouldn't like it, but it's more accurate to describe you as coming from the BRICS Bank. But the implication there is that it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and that's the limit of your remit. Is that accurate, first? And secondly, I know it's a very new institution. How far along have you gone in terms of looking for projects, financing this project? So do you restrict yourselves to those 5 countries? And have you done a lot of work since you started?
Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me for this. It's on? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me for this wonderful panel. Let me first of all tell a couple of words about the NDB, because it's a new institution. Officially, the bank was launched on July 15, 2015. In Fortaleza, 5 shareholders signed a Fortaleza agreement on the bank of on NDB. The NDB mandate is clearly defined in the article. The article says, shall I? Yeah, thank you.
Go on.
Fine. Yeah. Maybe I think it's better. The mandate of the bank, as it's described in the agreement, is clearly consists of 2 parts. First of all, the bank will mobilize the resources for infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS and other emerging economies and developing countries. The second one, the bank will complement the existing efforts of the international, multinational and regional financial institutions for global growth and development. As I said, the bank is quite new. We had only 2 annual meetings. The first annual meeting was held in Shanghai in July 2016. The second one was held in New Delhi in India in May 2017. Right now, the focus areas for NDB, I would describe it in 3 areas. First of all, the institutional capacity building. The second one will be the operations, and the third one is treasury. For the operations capacity building, NDB already adopted around 30 policy documents and rules of procedure. Among them, the policy on sovereign operations, policy on cooperation with international financial intermediaries, policy on non-sovereign operations. The second annual meeting adopted in principle the new strategy of the bank, which I hope to be published very soon. I will not explore more about the operations of the bank, since it's really brand new institution. We just adopted 7 projects in 5 member countries for the amount of $1.5 billion US. I would like to say about the connection between NDB and the Africa region. The article of agreement of NDB expressly provides that the first office, representative office of NDB, will be opened in Johannesburg in South Africa. We hope it will bring us more perspective, more projects in South Africa, and we are really encouraged to see this office to be operative as soon as possible. I would limit my presentation at the moment. Thank you.
All right, Alain, mine is going to be very, very simple. I think I was there when Africa 50 was being launched a few years ago. What have you done since then?
Well, that's...
And be careful, the president is sitting here listening.
Well, he's also the chairman of the
report on
board.
yourself.
He's the chairman of the board of directors of Africa 50. Mr. Chairman, welcome. And that's a rather direct question. Well, look, I think that Africa 50 is probably the newest development financial institutions which operating in Africa. So let me take 1 minute to say what Africa 50 is. We are an investment platform in infrastructure, which is owned by so far 23 African countries. The African Development Bank, of course, as a major shareholder and a sponsor, and the president of the African Development Bank is the chairman of the board of directors of Africa 50. And we also have 2 central banks, which are shareholders of Africa 50. Those shareholders, they have committed so far, and this is one milestone, close to $830 million of equity capital to Africa 50. But I think that more importantly, these shareholders have given us the mandate to operate commercially and to look to investing in projects which are financially sustainable and provide a return, because one of our other strategic goals, in addition to investing in infrastructure in Africa, is to tap long-term savings from within the continent and outside of Africa in order to channel those savings into infrastructure in Africa. So that's what Africa 50 is all about at this point, and we're building up our operations. We've approved our first project, which is a power project in Nigeria, and we're building the team, etc. But let me just reflect, on what it will take, in my opinion, to really raise the game in terms of infrastructure investment on the continent. Now, everybody knows the numbers in terms of the infrastructure gap. I think it's over $50 billion a year, which is a gap today that needs to be founded to basically invest. If you look at those numbers, everybody can reach the conclusion that the public sector cannot fund that gap alone. So there needs to be a significant amount of investment coming from the private sector. And we know how to do this. And you can only look at what has been done in other regions. For example, in 2015, Africa received only $8 billion of private investment in infrastructure. Latin America received about $34 billion, more than 4 times what Africa receives. Now, based on what I've seen in my previous capacity at the World Bank Group, and many of the panelists today will confirm that, there is no reason why Africa cannot raise its game to move from the $8 billion a year that we are getting today in private investment infrastructure to $35 billion of what Latin America is getting. There is no reason we cannot do it. We can do it through a number of specific policies and also a number of measures. And by the way, some of these things are already being done. But what we need to do is to scale up, to talk about the kind of numbers that my chairman likes to talk about, to invest $12 billion in energy, for example. We need to be able to get to those numbers. And one of the key challenges is to create more bankable projects. Because today, most people will tell you, money is really not the issue per se. There's quite a bit of money, including from pension funds, from institutional investors, even from DFIs, that can fund those projects once those projects are bankable. So one of the key things that Africa 50 will do, in partnership with the African Development Bank and other DFIs, and more importantly, with the private sector, we will try to help increase the number of bankable projects which are available to receive those fundings. So one of our first investments was indeed in a power project where we are developing that power project jointly with a Norwegian company, and to get those projects to the financing phase and raise money from banks. So these are the kind of things that we will do. Of course, you asked me not to be too long when we were preparing this session, so I won't explain too much, but I'll be available to have more input as needed.
All right, Charles, Alain has thrown a grenade in the room, which is that magic word, bankable. You're a banker. You even dress like a banker. What's bankable? Because everyone says bankable. We don't have enough bankable projects, and that's where the problem is. You're the banker. You're the bankabola.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Corbett. I work for Standard Chartered. I have done for the last 20 years. And we have been in Africa for nearly 150 years. So hopefully that at least puts pay to the concept that private funding is, a here today, gone tomorrow concept. But think it's interesting. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. What I think private sector does for Africa is something quite significant. I agree with the comments that Pierre made about the need for changes in regulation, about a more consistent regulatory framework across Africa, and I would congratulate the likes of Africa Finance Corporation and other development institutions for putting together conferences and panels and working parties to work on familiarizing people with a sort of a cross-sector, cross-country framework within which to invest in projects across Africa. We have a very active project finance team within Standard Chartered. We as a bank, again, to hopefully knock the concept of fly-by-night private sector investment on the head, we decided last year to double our investment in Africa as a bank rather than pull away, as you know, may have been accusations you could level at some other private sector institutions. So we are very committed to Africa. We have committed $5 billion to the Africa Power initiative under President Obama, and we continue to see it as our role in Africa to bring international financing to invest in Africa. Now, project finance is one route, and I think the panel will all agree that there are plenty of obstacles to creating an easy asset class in project finance for ease of investment by international investors. The way Standard Chartered looks at it is we are incredibly optimistic about the opportunities there are to bring international liquidity into Africa in various different guises. And frankly, we see the capital markets as the path of least resistance. We have succeeded in bringing billions of dollars into Africa in the last few years through a number of routes. I would say there are three intermediaries that we have used most successfully in the last few years to bring this funding in, and we see it as our role to bring this funding in for as long a term as possible. So first of all, I would say governments. We cannot ignore the fact that governments have to be at the forefront of their own infrastructure development. And we have been very successful, particularly of late, in bringing 10, 15-year funding into governments across Africa through the bond market, the international bond market. We have recently provided more than $1.5 billion of financing for Nigeria through that route in 10-year. We've also brought 16-year money to Senegal in a 1.5 billion transaction, which was concluded last year. So we see, as well as having professional project finance teams on the ground, we see lending to governments and attracting finance to governments in this way as a very successful way of bringing that initial funding to infrastructure. I would also say that the state-owned enterprises, we cannot ignore the fact that a lot of project finance in Africa is not necessarily greenfield, it's brownfield. And therefore, we're very proud of a facility we put together last year for Kenya Power and Lighting Corporation, whereby we restructured their balance sheet with the aid of the IDA World Bank, using a guarantee for 50% of the financing. We managed to transform a debt profile of 5 to 6 years for KPLC into a 10-year financing for which we also managed to bring their cost of funds down by 1.5% per annum. That, with the help of IDA, then freed up significant resources in terms of interest payment and principal repayment to enable a revitalization of the transmission and distribution network in Kenya. That, in turn, brought another 10,000 homes electricity, and I think that's a fantastic example of using established mechanisms, using established borrowers, and using the strength of a development institution to bring in international private side financing into Africa. The third and I think most important route where we as a private bank have been able to bring in funding from Asia, funding from the US, funding from Europe, has been through the work that the multilaterals do, such as AFC, such as Afrexim, such as Trade and Development Bank. And again, we're taking established borrowers who we ourselves have helped come to the short-term syndicated loan market over the last few years. And we're taking their track record, we're taking their creditor status in each of their member countries, and we're taking their management strength. And we're using that to attract investment into Africa via, let's face it, the path of least resistance, particularly where you have investment grade rated multilaterals. We are finding that we're able to bring 5-6-year finance into multilaterals in Africa. Again, we think the role of the development institutions is critical here. On a standalone basis, we see a ceiling of around 3 years for which the international market will lend to multilaterals in Africa. We believe that with the help of development institutions offering partial credit guarantees, we can easily bring that funding up to a much more competitive 5, 6, 7-year basis, which in turn then gets on lent for infrastructure funding and to enhance the capacity of African companies to manufacture and to enhance the goods, the raw materials available in their country. So again, we are a thoroughly optimistic bank about the opportunities for bringing funding into Africa. Yes, project finance has its difficulties, but we believe that there is enough of a positive message in Africa to bring long-term funding from the private sector, and we're very happy to be playing that role.
All right. Thank you, Charles, and my grandmother thanks you for the electricity. Mr. President, you cannot sit there without being part of our panel, so we will co-opt you very briefly into it. Alain already pointed out Africa 50 and the sort of work that you're trying to do, but also the larger question of the bank and where all these gaps are. Just to have a word or two from you. You can take the stage if you...
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure I dropped into this conversation. And first, let me thank all of you for honoring our invitation from Africa 50 to the New Development Bank, EBRD, and Standard Bank. You've been around for a long time, IFC, and also AFC. Thank you all very much for coming. I want to say that the critical issue is Africa has a huge infrastructure gap. And the issue is, how do you finance that? And the amount of money you actually need is anything between $60 to $80 billion gap that we have annually on infrastructure, whether you want to do power, you want to do rail, ports, or road and things like that. So the issue is, how do we get those monies? And I think for me, the issue is that the money is there, and I think Alan was beginning to talk about that. If you look at the size of the pension funds in Africa alone, it's roughly about $334 billion. And you look at the sovereign wealth funds, it's about $164 billion. But some of the projections actually tell you that the size of the pension funds will reach $1 trillion by 2030, 2025, 2030. So the money is there. The critical issue is, how do we create infrastructure as an asset class that allows the pension funds and other institutional investors to be able to invest there? And perhaps one of the things that we could think about is, how do we get them involved in the early phase so that when those projects are being developed, and then you can, in a relay way, just hand them over to them when the projects are more mature and the revenue streams are much clearer, then it's easier for them to finance. But I think we need to do a better job of leveraging the pension funds. And to your point, which you also raised on the case of from Standard Bank, on the importance of the capital markets within Africa. Our Vice President is here, Pierre. I'm sure he is better placed to say a lot of what we're doing. We're also working hard to integrate the stock exchanges in Africa, from Casablanca to Cairo to Lagos to Nairobi, and so that we can also deepen these capital markets. We have a fund which we have set up, which is called the Africa Domestic Bond Fund, that we funded for $200 million to further deepen those capital markets. But also, Pierre and his team have developed something which we are very proud of with Bloomberg, which is the Africa Domestic Bond Index, which allows us to benchmark a lot of things like that if you're going to do that. But I also think that we should do a lot more in terms of local currency financing, because the currency mismatch it's a real issue, and there's a lot of opportunities for that. The bank does a lot of local currency financing. The point that Alan raised is so critical about project preparation. If you take a look at, I talked to somebody from I think it's Blackstone or BlackRock, one of them. And they say, well, I've got $5 billion to invest, and I can't find projects. And so we need to do a lot of work of putting money into instruments that allows us to prepare projects that are, to your word, bankable. Yeah, you have to be bankable. That people can actually put a lot of money into. That's why we created Africa 50, and they are doing that. IFC is working quite a lot. Everybody on this panel, they are all working very hard on that issue. I want to say one word about the issue of guarantees, and the guarantees work. Whether it's a partial credit guarantee or partial risk guarantees that we use, all of us on this panel use this very, very well. They work. But only about 4% of all of the MDB portfolio actually goes into guarantees. So if you want to do infrastructure at scale, I think what we've got to do is to mutualize these guarantees. It's to make sure we create co-guarantee facilities that allows us to do risk at scale. So many projects all at once. And that's the way we're going to actually do a lot more and fast track on infrastructure. And to the last part of how do we attract the institutional investors, the African Development Bank, we say, well, look, the money is up here, the need is here in Africa, and there's a lot of how do you connect where the money is and where the needs are, and how do you de-risk that? And that's why we decided we're going to create this thing called the Africa Investment Forum. Not because we want to have another forum to talk. No, there's not going to be no talks in that forum. It's really a forum of transaction, fully transactional. And all the partners you see here are all going to be part of that forum. So we bring people together and you say, here are the projects, here are the investors that want to invest in it. But there are market risk, there are political risk, there are currency risk, there are also other kinds of risk. But how can we help to unblock that? And what are the policy, legal, regulatory, governance constraints that preclude investments from happening? And how can the heads of state do their job in making it happen? And so I think that I look forward to the outcome of this particular panel and to your interactions and how we can fit some of that into what we all agree to work on this Africa Investment Forum. I think that, with the kind of work that IFC is doing, the Standard Bank has been there for a very, very long time. AFC just had a forum on infrastructure, which was great. And we also see EBRD and also New Development Bank and Africa 50. If all these guys that are here can't make infrastructure happen, I don't know who else is going to do it. And so we're just delighted you're here, and we look forward to some of the things that you have to tell us after that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President Adesina. And that's a good place to still take it up, Ching Dongwa. For me, where I come from, IFC tends to be sort of the canary in the gold mine, which is, in effect, leading the private sector, people like Charles and all the rest, to see possibilities where perhaps we're not seeing them before. And I don't know whether that's a fair characterization of what the IFC does. So just take us through that, especially in the context of infrastructure. What do you see that they don't see yet, and how do you help them to see the light?
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the African Bank for your invitation. It's very hard to follow President Adesina to speak, but I'll try. As we are in incredible India, and we heard Prime Minister Modi about the incredible achievement India has done, let me share one thing that is a milestone that India has achieved. This year, corporate India raised more funds from capital market than from banks. Wow. For IFC itself, India is the largest destination of IFC's investment. 3/4 of what we do are in Indian rupee, not in dollars. We, a while back, partnered with an Indian private sector bank called Axis Bank. They issued a 10-year infrastructure bond in the domestic bond market under the infrastructure regulation, which is enabling fundraising for infrastructure, connecting their domestic savings to infrastructure financing. We simultaneously issued a masala bond, an Indian rupee-linked bond out of London from international investors. We bought the entire proceed of that infrastructure bond issued by Axis Bank, therefore directly connecting international saving to domestic infrastructure financing. So since Addis Ababa 2 years ago, when global community really recognized the centrality of development finance must be private sector led, I think we have been working on solutions, as everybody talked about. How do we crowd in private sector capital? Meanwhile, we know after global financial crisis, you have $8 or $9 trillion in OECD countries sitting in negative interest rate or zero interest rate. Another 25 to 30 trillion sitting in very low interest rate. But very little goes to emerging market. So I think we felt, as IFC has been one of the largest syndicated loan leaders, having done about 50 billion, we felt that it's not really just telling them, look, there is investment opportunity, it's a gap between perceived risk and real risk. We just have to do something to de-risk, to make those infrastructure assets in emerging market countries attractive. So therefore, we started working with insurance companies. And we found a solution where we are able to put in a first loss together with Swedish development agency, SIDA, and we were able to structure a senior tranche at BBB rating. And selling those value proposition based on the track record of IFC, selling our future origination capability to institutional investors. So we plan to raise about $5 billion under this facility with $1 billion about to be signed with 2 global insurance companies. So this is one concrete example. Another example is really how do we recognizing that in a lot of countries, the domestic savings pool is getting very large. But meanwhile, they have very few choices apart from their government treasury. How do we create investable asset? And this is where the World Bank Group did something with Colombia, where in 2014, the government announced a very ambitious $24 billion fourth generation highway program, where they wanted to build, improve about 6,000 kilometers of highways, broken down into about 40 different projects, entirely PPP, because the government's debt situation is not sustainable. So the World Bank helped to improve the regulatory framework, standardize PPP. We also helped to structure a project bond arrangement together with a national development bank called FDN, where we de-risk the construction risk. So the project bond is attractive to the domestic pension and international investor. We also set up an infrastructure debt fund to anchor invest in some of the bond fund. Yeah? So just to take, so of the 40 projects, 19 have been tendered. Now I just want to use the first project as a good example. It's a $2.2 billion section of the highway. 43% financing came from bond, about half in Colombia peso, targeting domestic savings, half of it in US dollar, targeting international savings, 19-year maturity. 34% in bank debt financing at 12-year maturity. Yeah, so banks still play a critical role, but they cannot stomach a longer maturity, and the rest is equity. And this model, I'm sure we can replicate in Africa. So let me end by saying, if one day in Kenya, in Nigeria, we can also issue domestic bonds, whether it's...
And if I may just interrupt, is that fully subscribed?
More than fully subscribed, yeah, oversubscribed in each issuance, because the risk and structure of the project bond is such that you take a 15% first loss, subordinated facility, and meanwhile, the government has a toll backup facility. If the toll revenue falls under a threshold, the government will basically pay out. That really made the structure very much investable by the pension investors, and the whole structure is rated a BBB international, AA plus in domestic market. And these structures are already happening. And I think, as President Adesina said, and Charles, you mentioned this, I think capital market is not the path of least resistance. It is the only way to connect savings to infrastructure financing with scale. And our job as a multilateral institution is to help structure, help solve upstream regulatory challenges, and also de-risk so the investor feel safe that these are very good investable assets.
All right, thank you. And Adeshagun, I think yours is to tell us where AFC falls into this very broad ecosystem has been described by everyone here, including the president. Where do you fall into this?
Thank you very much, moderator. Good afternoon. AFC actually represents a paradigm shift in terms of financing of infrastructure in Africa. We're a public-private institution. We were set up 10 years ago with an authorized capital of $2 billion. Today, our balance sheet size is $3.5 billion. We've actually financed projects close to about $4.5 billion on the African continent. We are present in 28, or operational footprint in 28 African countries. I'd address first the issue of bankability. We have, in the past 10 years, actually helped to create 4 bankable projects. One of them is the SEM Power project, which is the largest independent power project in Ghana, a 350 megawatt project, 900 million. We were co-developers of that project. We also helped to develop a project, a renewable, the first commercial wind farm project in Cape Verde. That contributes about that's 28 megawatt project. It contributes close to about 50% of the output in Cape Verde. Recently, we closed a Pit to power project in Rwanda, which is also going to represent about 40% of the output of power in Rwanda. So we have, over the last 10 years, created a decent track record of developing bankable projects.
You know, there's something that I'm picking up on a lot of stuff that was said, but the first one I want to begin with is perhaps a bit of an anecdote, because I do sit on the board of a pension scheme, and the thing I've noticed sitting on that pension scheme in Kenya is not so much the absence of projects, Chingdongwa, it's more to do with the rules under which we operate. So the rules of the pension overseer or the pension regulator in Kenya say they can only invest in certain infrastructure, not infrastructure, but certain investment classes. And we had to take almost a year to convince them that we could invest in private equity, for instance. So how does that fit into this issue that has been brought to the table, which is, yes, there's huge pools of money from pension schemes, from other saving schemes on the continent of Africa, but there's a missing link between those pools of money and where the projects are. So for me, where I sit when we're making those decisions is we know we have to stick to certain percentages, and we have to write to, in Kenya, it's called the Retirement Benefits Authority, to say, can we please invest in this? And it takes a very long time for them to approve it. Obviously, they have the heart in the right place, because it's simply a matter of keeping pensioners' funds safe. But how do you get them to understand that this is not a risky thing? You should actually allow pension schemes to invest.
I also sit on the board of World Bank Group's pension committee.
But yours is a lot larger than ours.
So we think alike. Look, for any pension investors, the first key to a safe long-term obligation to pensioner is diversification. Right now, in a lot of African countries, because nominal interest rates are so high, people find just parking in treasury bills is just a no-brainer. But I think if you think 30, 40, 50 years out, when I believe, and I'm very optimistic, just like Charles, that when Africa has a macroeconomic foundation that is very solid, you will see nominal interest rate dropping into low single digit, right? And then you will have a landscape where risk-return combinations will become very, very important. So, for example, 3 years ago, when we issued our first Niger bond in Nigeria, we did work a couple of years with the pension committee, Pension Commission of Nigeria, just to make sure the pension regulation starts to expand its investable universe beyond the government treasury. So I think, this probably is a medium to long-term goal, but now African Bank, the World Bank Group, we have a job to do in terms of working with pension regulators, working with government, in terms of reforming that pension investment guidelines to allow a much broader investable assets into this, and then let the market take care of the rest.
Sorry. Janet, I want to pick up also on something that you hinted at, which is when you work with municipal infrastructure projects, so this is water, sewerage, and all the rest, I suspect you will bump up against politics. So practically speaking, when you invest in water projects, there will be returns that are sought, which means that, number one, people will need to pay for water. Secondly, the tariffs on that water are going to be higher than people are used to, which then becomes a political issue. And I suspect it's the same thing for roads when it comes to tolling roads and all the rest. Surely this must be one of the things that you have to account for when you're trying to design projects and trying to figure out how to make them work.
Certainly. The president, when he spoke a few minutes ago, also mentioned the role of sovereign wealth funds. And Kazakhstan, where I was the last 4.5 years, actually had a very innovative program where they decided to put roughly $2.5 billion through institutions like EBRD, the World Bank, IFC, and Eurasian Development Bank, as well as Islamic Development Bank, in order to have a counter-cyclical infrastructure stimulus program for the government. And the way we used that was that we soon recognized that these companies were not commercially viable on their own, municipal infrastructure companies, and that you couldn't raise the tariffs high enough in order to make them commercially viable. So we actually worked on a program with the Kazakh government where we used the funds from the Sovereign Wealth Fund for grants at a level so that the essentially 30-year loans, but in effect grants, for the portion of the facility needed to modernize the water, waste, municipal transport, et cetera, that couldn't be commercially viable. So it was really quite an innovative way, and also in a very difficult time in Central Asia when growth was actually negative next door in Russia. Kazakhstan managed to maintain a growth rate of around 4%. So it was kind of a creative way of using funds to help commercialize companies. But you're right, it's a very difficult political trade-off whenever you start to look at tariffs and tariff policy.
Right, Pierre, maybe the same question to you, because you have huge experience in sort of all 54 African countries. How do you deal with that political question? Because sometimes I suspect Charles and his fellow bankers will be very hesitant to get into projects simply because of that. So you'll finance a project and soon enough people will say we're not willing to pay commercial rates for whatever it is that's being provided, whether it's a road or, in this case, municipal projects.
No, absolutely. So I'll start maybe with a story about financing water in Africa. I was involved like 30 years ago, if I may say so, in financing the privatizations and the concession of the Conakry water distribution system. And that was a great example, that was in the late 80s, of how when you combine public and private sector tools, you can achieve quite a lot. Doing things in water is difficult, partly because people feel they shouldn't pay for water, right? So the concept there was that as the assets were completely dilapidated, you first had to bring the assets back to quality water supply. And as that was going up, the quality, thanks to the concessionaire coming in, the private company coming in to restructure the company, the water company, you were able to raise the tariff. During that period, there was a viability gap financing that was funded by, at the time, was the World Bank. And so you have a mechanism, and a lot of these viability gaps will be needed in sectors where the private sector will provide the best solution, technically, operationally, even financially, but the consumer, the user, is not able to pay the full cost. So I think we need to think much more. Some infrastructure, if you look at ports and airports, should be fully commercially viable, but many others in the water area in many cases, toll roads in many cases, will require an element of subsidy to bridge this viability gap. And that's where we have another set of players that comes in, those and a lot of the bilateral and multilateral grant agencies that can come in and help make these deals happen through blended finance instruments, in sense, which we, as well as others, are managing. To me, it's a key area. For one, sectors where the private sector can provide a better solution, but the consumer cannot pay the full cost, and otherwise the state would pay it with taxes, right? So it's a kind of or with development money. And two, we also have a significant issue. If you look at the type of countries we talk about, they tend to be the middle-income countries of Africa. There are lots of other countries, other low-income countries, sometimes fragile countries, where you need that extra boost to make a private sector project, private financing possible. So I think, for example, if you want to link up landlocked countries to the global economy, whether it's with roads, rail, or even telecommunications, in many cases, you will need to provide a concessional dimension. So finding better ways to blend private commercial money raised on the markets with public money to make the public good happen, to compensate for externalities, to give the private operator the time to go from a pretty low performance situation to a normal operating situation where you can pay, where users will be willing to pay a full tariff. It's one key area, and I think one that is really ripe for scaling up. A lot more can be done. It is not because the user today cannot pay the full price that a project should be funded by the public sector alone.
Alain, I want to give you back that little grenade you threw a few minutes ago, which is the bankability question. And I was in a conference in Nairobi about 2 weeks ago, and this question did come up about bankability of projects. Because it was a conference that was hosted by ATIA, the African Trade Insurance Agency, the issue of insurance came up, and I think it has been well handled. But the other one, which was interesting to me, was just about basic project design, especially basic projects financial design, which is where some of the participants there were hinting that may be where the problem lies. We don't have enough expertise on the continent to design projects well from a financial point of view, such that when it goes to the bankers, there's so much work that needs to be put in before this project is ready that perhaps they feel it may be a bit, it may not be worth it. So where with regard to expertise in terms of just basic design of infrastructure projects in Africa to make them bankable?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And the issue of bankability, it's something that I suppose is a challenge in many emerging markets, actually. It's not only an African issue. It's a sign in some of the least developed countries which don't have, the skills and the experience in putting together those projects. And it takes a lot of time in those places to come up with projects which are bankable. Indeed, we still find projects which are bankable in these countries, but we don't have enough of them. We don't have the kind of scale that we need to have and the kind of efficient process that we need to have a lot of those projects to meet the needs. In most countries on the continent today, there is probably a PPP, which is bankable, which has been financed by a bank or an investor. In some countries, there are a few of them. In Kenya, for example, we have many bankable projects. So it's quite known what makes a good bankable project. Essentially, you have risk in the project which are allocated to the parties which are the best able to manage those risks, and the parties which are creditworthy enough for investors to be sufficiently comfortable that they will recover their money, loans, and make a decent returns. And even though when those parties are not creditworthy enough, then you have political risk instruments, political risk mitigation instruments from DFIs that can backstop those parties to make the project bankable. So the bankability issue is well understood. what we need to do is to try to make sure that in those countries, those governments, there is enough capacity, skills, experience developed within the government first to kind of put together many such projects in a well-designed way so that when those projects are brought to the banks and investors, those investors and those banks do not reopen the contract and say, hey, this provision is not bankable, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of expertise in the market, including from advisors. Sometimes they are very expensive advisors, but it's better to have those expensive advisors advise you to have a bankable project in the first round, rather than trying to do something on the cheap, and then you have to revisit the project, and actually takes too much time. So again, my view is that if a government wants to do a project the right way, there's political will, government commitment to doing so, then that project will be done. Because there's enough people, including on this panel, that will be willing to offer advice and support to make this thing happen. So it's not a very difficult thing to do. I think it starts with the will from the government. And once you have that, also the other thing which is very important, pick the right parties in the consortium, in the project, to make the project happen. Sometimes even the government that means well will pick a sponsor that has no track record in developing something, and then the project is not going to be bankable, at least not soon enough. So those are some of the things that I wanted to say. Again, this is not rocket science. It can be done. It has been done in many places in Africa and outside of Africa. We just need to get to scale.
You know, you were speaking then, Adeshogun smiled, Jing Dongwa put up his hand, so we'll go with the guy who put up his hand first, and then with the guy who smiles, please.
Okay, I just wanted to add to what Alan was saying. I mean, it is true that you have skills gap in governments, but then you have institutions like AFC, where we actually provide advice, both technical and financial, in helping to fill those gaps. And you know, you see in a project like the one we did in Côte d'Ivoire, you see how that plays out. We were the ones who financed the third bridge across Ebre Lagoon. That's the Henri Conan Bédier Bridge. We actually also participated in ensuring that that project was bankable. We actually supported the consortium that was given the concession. We provided technical advice to the government of Côte d'Ivoire. And you will see there, and that also addresses some of the point that Pierre was raising earlier. We advise the government to engage with the community before setting the tolls. So you find a situation where that community engagement helped when the tolls were finally introduced, when the project was completed. So I think there's...
And just to take you up on that, because that's a very fascinating point that you're making.
Yes.
I know it sounds very boring technically to say it like this, but those tools for community engagement, because in lots of parts of Africa where you hear this community engagement, you'll still come back and hear communities being dissatisfied, and you'd find out that the community engagement didn't happen to the depth it should have happened, or with the right people, or whatever. Those just developing of those tools, how do you speak to communities? How do you make them understand complex financial things in ways that can come to them? Just take us through that.
Well, what we've done, I mean, we do have, you know, I don't want to get too technical, the environmental and social standards that we all sort of adhere to when we're doing these projects. But we ensure that governments actually actively meet with the community leaders, explain to them what will be the benefits of the project in terms of employment, in terms of, you know, incidental consequential benefits for actually using the project. So it's a deliberate strategy to educate them that this is not, because what usually happens is that most of the communities don't want to pay because they think it's a public good. So you have to explain to them that this is going to ease a burden that was hitherto existing, and so it is in your interest to pay the toll.
All right, Jing Dongwa, you want to
Yeah, a couple points. The first one is I very much agree with Pierre on the need to blend, especially for a first of a kind, to demonstrate it works, to solve some bottleneck that otherwise would not exist. And the second is certainly upstream work, whether it's regulatory reform or putting our own money to do the feasibility study, to hire the lawyers, to structure the project. IC has an infra venture fund that we created 8 years ago, and that's exactly for that, right? We put our own money to design the project at early stage. But I wanted to switch the conversation a little bit around, right? If we have institutional investors, your pension, your insurance, your asset manager, we don't want to scare them into the inner works of each and every infrastructure project. For them, really, how can we offer as a community a portfolio of projects so that on the whole, it has a financial behavior that is attractive? The ultimate solution is capital market, because through capital market, rating agencies will come in and measure the feasibility of the whole thing. So we lessen the burden for investors, and that will attract more investment into it. But that means that we as a community, whether Standard Chartered, the investment bank, AFC, ISC, World Bank, AFDB, Africa 50, we have to collectively do the heavy lifting, from regulatory reform, structuring bankable projects, getting the risk return right, so on and so forth. So how do we as a community then turn around? And this is where I don't want to re-emphasize, but the partnership we have Allianz with Prudential to tell them, look, here is our 60-year of track record. And they like it. And they each give us $500 million based on that track record, but they don't know where we're going to invest because we're giving them our capability, but they pre-commit for a future, portfolio of projects. I think that probably is an easier way to unlock, because institutional investors fear that they have to now have project financing experts for each and every project. So I just want to highlight that point.
So your big currency is your reputation and your track record. Before we come to you, and I promise that we're going to include everyone in this conversation, Charles, you wanted to come in on this part of the conversation.
Thank you. I think it's probably one of the difficulties of having so many panelists is that there are a lot of points to pick up on, which I think, so I wanted to pick up on one in general, which is that the tone of the conversation is very constructive. So we have a number of different bodies at the panel, and I think we have grown to realize that the lack of infrastructure investment, or the gap that still remains in infrastructure investment isn't necessarily anyone's particular fault. I mean, it used to be, why don't the commercial banks step up to proper longer tenor infrastructure finance? Well, frankly, we have different stakeholders, we have different shareholders, we have different people whose money we're looking after, and therefore we don't have the ability to come to that sort of tenor of financing. Nor do we have the capacity to take on the risks that we've identified as a panel on various projects. So the political risks, whether a toll road is going to be accepted. There are large examples, most recently in Nigeria, where toll roads simply didn't function because there was not the political will, to make them work. And that is not a risk that a commercial bank will take once it's been identified in a large-scale project, in the recent past. I think local currency is also a very important point to pick up on. I agree with what Jingdon said, and I think your point about the Kenyan insurance pension fund was very important. We were able to bring 7-year Kenyan shilling money into the Kenya Power and Lighting Corporation transaction I talked about, without any form of guarantee required for the World Bank. Why would you need it? And I agree that there's a huge amount of capacity for local pension funds to invest in projects locally in their country. Perhaps it needs some form of government support, and it certainly needs some form of regulatory framework to allow those investments to take place. But it absolutely makes sense that local pension funds should be investing in the local currency infrastructure needs of their country. I would also say that as part of what we see at Standard Chartered of our role of improving capital markets within the countries in which we operate in Africa, we should also see it as our responsibility to broaden and deepen the local bank market. So again, a natural local currency source of funds for projects, It's in all of our interest that the local bank market is developed. We do that to the best of our ability. I think in Nigeria, some 2 billion was invested in the electricity privatization by Nigerian banks. And I think it's important that, the international investor community continues to support and to lend funds to local banks and to help develop the local markets in our regions. The final point I would make, and I think this is a very important one that the President set out, 4% of development institution funds going towards a guarantee. We see a huge opportunity for that to be increased. And as Jing Dong said, there are identifiable risks within each project where I think a risk mitigation or a guarantee of some form from a development institution like IFC is absolutely critical. So for project finance, it works. Also, I think for longer-term finance, to go back to the point I was making about multilaterals and how we can fund infrastructure via multilaterals without having to do the deep due diligence on each project, it's very important that we can use DFI partial guarantees to increase the tenor to which the international market will lend to multilaterals. We had a very successful transaction last year for African Exim Bank, whereby China Exim fully guaranteed a 5-year issuance for them to on-lend for long-term assets. Behind that structure, we brought in 16 different Chinese banks who were lending into that structure to Afrexim for the first time. And given our experience in capital markets, I can tell you that 3/4 of those Chinese banks would not have contemplated lending long-term funds to an African financial institution before then. I think there's so much more we can do. It needn't be Chexim. It is absolutely the right conversation that we're hearing now, that other development institutions are more open to this concept of supporting commercial banks and recognizing that we can't have the same long-term risk appetite or risk appetite for political risks, for example, that we would like to have, but there are plenty of ways of boosting that support that we can offer.
All right, and as we're coming to the floor, I just want to recognize that we've been joined by Minister Claver Gatete, Finance Minister for Rwanda. Welcome to you, sir. These are the guys you should be asking for money, by the way. They're all sitting here. So I will move up here so I can see everyone. And now that I'm up here, we want to go to you as we're still getting more and more submissions. I think the conversation is getting very interesting. All I'll ask you to do is put your hand up if I do recognize you and have 4 eyes, so I'll try and see everyone. Just stand up, say your name, and make it extremely brief so we can try and get in as many comments and questions as possible. If it's a question, please let us know who you're directing it to. So I see you, sir. I see you there. The lights are in my eyes. I see 2 hands. Is that correct? No, 3. So there's 2 gentlemen there and 1 gentleman here. Oh, and those guys who are waving like they're in a music concert. So we'll start with you, sir. Just name and please stand up and which institution perhaps you represent and your very quick submission.
Good afternoon. My name is Ibukun Adebayo from the London Stock Exchange Group. My question is for Jing Dong and for any other of the panelists, and specifically on the question of local currency financing. The specific question here is, what is it that, in particular, African countries need to do in terms of creating the framework for allowing greater flows of currency offshore, raised offshore, coming back into the country? I know India has done extraordinarily well here with the RBI's framework in terms of masala bonds, and can that be replicated across Africa? And if so, which countries do you believe that can happen in first? Thank you.
All right, trying to remember who had put their hands up. So you, sir, right here at the back, the 2 gentlemen there, and is there anyone I've forgotten? We'll see them anyway. So you, please, sir.
My name is Caleb Dengu. I come from CDF Trust in Zimbabwe. We wanted to really understand how the multilaterals could give a wrapper in any infrastructure financing structure, because what is happening is you can get a concession agreement, but when you get into the market, even if the project is viable, the country risk sometimes puts off the investors. So what we wanted was to see whether African Development Bank, AfroExim, could provide that, or multilateral MIGA, after all, can provide a wrapper which gives the country risk guarantee if the project is viable. Can we get an instrument which is properly designed to take care of those kind of projects, because they are long-term, they are not like short-term projects which depend on the political environment at that time.
So when your father is too risky, you want to have a temporary foster father?
Yes.
Okay. The microphones should be somewhere that side by now. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Mahesh Kotacha, Structured Credit International. I'm the president. I'm an advisor to several multilateral development banks, including some around the table there. My comment and question is regarding the construct of the guarantee. I used to work for a decade at MBIA, a financial guarantor, AAA rated in the US, that still exists. And I founded Asia Limited, which was a single A-rated Asian financial guarantee company. So I know about guarantees a little bit, and actually 4% is a decline from what it used to be around 15% for some of the development banks. So one point is there's a great lacuna of the use of multilateral development banks' guarantee capacity. If you go back to the foundation of the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institution was founded to provide guarantees, not loans, but it's done reverse. So the instrument of guarantees is grossly underutilized by banks, because by development banks, because they seem to find power and prestige in the money and not in guarantees, whereas guarantees are equally powerful. And the MBIAs of the world, when they were around, some of them have been decimated by the financial crisis, guaranteed more in emerging market financings than all the multilaterals put together. Data about 7 years ago. I did that number. And Gene Rothberg was in the audience, and he agreed with that. So the comment is really actually better instrumentation. 100% guarantees are really, I think the China Transaction African Bank was 100% guaranteed, I understand, not partial guarantees. Investors want simplicity. I agree with Jing Dong. They don't want to do a lot of hard work, but if they are partial guarantees, they must do the hard work, because that's the lesson of the financial crisis, that if you don't do the hard work, you get your head handed to you. Okay. So my comment to you is about innovation. Where can we find full 100% guarantees, irrevocable and conditional? Is there a role for those? Is there a possibility of those? Or is the financial guarantee industry that existed completely dead? That actually exists currently in the US. Right. There are a few still around. So I'd like to throw that out and see if there's any comment on that.
All right, thank you. There's a gentleman just in front of you there. Yes.
Bien, je vous remercie. Je suis centrafricain. Je suis le gouverneur de la Banque africaine de développement pour la Centrafrique. Je suis intéressé par le débat pour spécifiquement ce qui concerne le financement des investissements dans les pays post-conflit. Comment nos partenaires tels que la Banque mondiale, SFI, le Fonds monétaire peuvent appuyer ces pays qui veulent sortir définitivement d'une crise dont les populations expriment des attentes très très grandes, mais malheureusement font face à des programmes avec les instituts de Bretton Woods qui imposent un certain niveau d'endettement qui empêche même de faire des investissements. Il y a des besoins pour la population exprimés. On veut sortir à travers les investissements pour augmenter la croissance, mais on est bloqué dans le carcan des programmes qui font qu'on ne peut pas avancer sur les investissements alors qu'on a besoin des investissements pour avancer. Alors, est-ce que la Banque mondiale et les institutions peuvent aider les pays qui ont envie de sortir à trouver des issues faciles pour faciliter donc les investissements dans ces pays-là. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur. Just trying to see which hands I've missed. I see you there. Any others? Looking carefully, so there's those two at the end, I think, just that front row. Just confirming any other person who wants to jump in. So just you three gentlemen, and then we'll come back to the panel to get some answers. Yes.
Hi, my name is Brian Pinto. I'm with the ADF Policy Lab. And this is a question to the gentleman from IFC or from Standard Chartered. Could you explain what you meant by the observation that capital markets were the path of least resistance? Does that mean it was the easy way out, or countries could get money and do whatever they wanted with it? So could you please elaborate? Thanks.
All right, just pass the microphone all the way down to the end of your row. Oh, there's another one. Okay.
I'm Kupuswamy from one of the infrastructure companies of India, the Shapoorji Pallonji Group. My question is, a lot of the projects in India, in the infrastructure sector, we have learned that there will be definitely a viability gap. And that has to be funded by the state, mostly. Because be it a toll project or be it something else, it will not be possible to, the project, repay the entire loan amount over the period that is given to it. One suggestion has been that the viability gap in respect of projects in Africa ought to be funded on a long-term basis by multilaterals or by...
Sorry, sir, just 1 second, because
Yeah.
I work in television. Just take a step to your right.
I'm sorry.
To your, no, to the front, to your
Okay,
right, because the lights are just above your head, so he's
Is that
struggling.
okay?
I think that should be fine.
That's fine,
Yes,
fine.
it is fine, yes. So please, carry on.
Now, I think we ought to work out certain solutions for the viability gap to be funded by a suitable mechanism. Is there any thinking on that in this forum?
All right, to be sure, have I missed anyone? I don't want anyone coming to attack me with a 2x4, saying I didn't take their question. No, no one. Oh, yes.
Hello, my name is Ram Karaturi. I'm an investor in agribusiness in East Africa. Between Kenya and Ethiopia, I have an investment of $160 million. All of it funded from the capital markets of India. Still haven't seen a cent of return, but I still believe agriculture is a very good investment to get into.
So hold on, are we not eating enough?
Sorry?
Are we not eating enough? I should be evidence that
I mean,
there's returns.
I have two comments and one question.
Yes.
One, strangely, as it may sound, the poorest pay the most. And in Africa is no exception. The fact that you pay over $350 for a bag of maize when the Americans pay $180 proves the point. It's the same thing with wheat. It's the same thing with rice. $350 out of India and Vietnam and Thailand. By the time it reaches, our good friends in the West Coast, Nigeria, suddenly it's at $800 to $1,000. I mean, obviously, I'm missing the story here. The poor are the richest in the world because obviously they're paying at the price of caviar for the price of maize. Here is my question. The most abused word I've heard in Africa for the last 40 years is capacity building. Now, why don't we use this most abused word in agriculture? Why can't we try to get the multilaterals to guarantee, along with the local governments, a guaranteed return on investment in agriculture to propel agriculture investment, to bring in capacity? Why does it cost 2,900 shillings for a 90 kg bag of dry maize out of Nakuru when I can land one bag for about 2,000 shillings in Mombasa? As long as we cannot compete, and how can African maize cost much more than American maize? Transportation cost, 10 US cents a ton kilometer. We need to do something about infrastructure, but much more than that, we have to eliminate the risk associated with African agriculture. So my question here is, like you do it for power sector, like you do it for infrastructure, the highways, if you actually believe in feeding Africa and getting rid of this 35 billion import deficit, why don't we start with guaranteeing some return to agriculture? Because there are not going to be too many territories who's willing to put 165 million and wait for another 2 decades. And the second elephant in the room is GMO. Here we are, we're continuing to kill people with malnutrition, with hunger.
I love the topic of food as it's very evident in many respects. What I'm wondering is, how do you correlate that question you're about to get, which is GMO, about infrastructure?
Yeah, I'll just come to that.
If you just be quick about it, so we can,
Between the multilaterals and the leadership, that is the political leadership of Africa, future will hold you responsible for the genocide, which the future will determine the millions of lives that are being lost today to starvation because of your principled stand on GMO.
Okay,
I think we have to wake up to that reality.
Thank you, and it is an interesting and important part of the conversation, but the one I want to pick out on from your intervention as we come to our panel to get this discussed is something you hinted upon, which is it costs a lot, which goes back to the infrastructure question again. It does cost a lot to just eat, which is an infrastructure question. A lorry goes from one part of one country to another part, or from one country to the other. And that infrastructure question comes in. I think that's one of the bits that I want to pick up. But as we come to the end of this conversation, starting with you, Alain, I want for you to pick up whatever it is of the questions and submissions that came in and your final questions as we come gradually towards the end of this conversation.
Thank you, Wallace. I think I'd like to say a few words about that whole issue of guarantees. And I think it's not because my chairman who mentioned that earlier, but clearly we need to figure out a way to significantly increase the level of guarantees from developing financial institutions to make the infrastructure project bankable. And indeed, the incentive at some point, and they still are actually within many development financial institutions, were structured to push for these institutions to provide loans as opposed to guarantees to enable private sector participation. There needs to be a paradigm shift from many institutions so that they would facilitate private sector participation by offering guarantees, partial guarantees. I probably would not argue strongly for 100% guarantees because there is an issue of balance sheet capacity of those institutions. So partial risk guarantees to enable private sector participation is actually, in my opinion, a very, very important step that we should see. And this also would address some of the concerns that were raised by the minister from Central African Republic. Post-conflict countries are in a very challenging situation because they have limited resources. They need to figure out ways to attract private investment, but private investors are sometimes reluctant to go into those places because the risks are perceived to be high. Then you go again to the issue of guarantees to trying to address specific risks to enable private sector participation in these countries because they don't have enough public resources to fund the needs that they have. So I think that that's an important point that I wanted to mention. The other point I wanted to mention in closing, at least on my side, in addition to making a big plea and push for increasing project development support, meaning that there has to be a bit more early stage risk capital and project development resources allocated to build up the portfolio of bankable projects. I took note of what AFC did in building up a few projects already. We at Africa 50, we're building up some projects, but we need to see a lot more. IC Infraventures is actually at IFC, one of the instruments that I worked on when at IFC. This is the way to go. Coming in the early stages to build up the pipeline of bankable projects is totally something which is very, very appropriate. Finally, the issue of longer-term financing. We need to figure out ways to enable longer-term financings to fund this infrastructure project. I'd like to mention one example to finish. One big dam project in Africa that was financed by the private sector. Hydro projects have a useful life in excess for 50 years, okay? If you finance an hydro project which has a useful life in excess of 50 years with 15 years money, even 17 years money, and try to amortize the whole financing over 15 to 17 years. It creates a higher tariff than they need to be. We can come up with some structures whereby you have a synthetic financing which looks like a 30 years financing with a bullet payment at year 17, for example, which will be backstopped. The refinancing risk will be backstopped by entities such as DFIs, so that you can actually spread the tenure of the maturity of the financing and reduce the average tariff. These are the kind of things that would provide more fuel to financing infrastructure projects, and I wanted to finish with that particular suggestion.
And that's a great point to make. I wish we had time to explore it, because it sounds extremely fascinating. Sergey, anything that perhaps jumped out at you from the questions, from the submissions, and maybe your final comments as well?
Thank you very much. The conversations, those conversations for me was quite educative. I learned a lot and I heard a lot, and I think that the knowledge that I gained here will complement the work of NDB and definitely will help us to develop the proper procedures. In particular, I heard about the guarantees operations, which are quite important and should be developed further in the NDB's operations in the future, in particular in the Africa region. So I'm very appreciative, and I'm very thankful for giving me the opportunity to listen to the ideas and the problems which were addressed here. Thank you.
All right, Janet, anything perhaps, and also your final question?
Sure. Just two real quick takeaways. I have to say I agree very strongly with my colleague from the IFC. I think the best way to involve the private sector is to take away the individual project risk, and capital markets certainly are the solution. Only local currency in the long run is sustainable financing. Guarantees just help to keep in place some of the market distortions that exist. But sustainable local currency finance. And then the second key point, which quite a number of people alluded to, is the need for project preparation facilities. And I think the fact that we have representatives of seven or eight different institutions here in this panel is indicative that we really need to work together in a more, how would you say, a more structured forum in order to divide up what are our best areas of expertise. But clearly it's capital markets and project preparation.
All right, Pierre?
I'd like to echo what Janet just said and Charles before. Very positive conversation. We're in this together. We are the African Development Bank. Our job is not just to lend to Africa, but it's to catalyze investment into Africa. And we cannot do it alone. We need to do it in partnership. These are great partners, and there are more. We just need to find ways to bring this partnership into a more structured, scalable manner so that we don't have to, for each deal, reinvent, in a sense, the wheel. So that's my first point. The second one, I'd like to echo the governor for Central Africa and the specific issues that are faced by conflict-affected countries and landlocked countries. And Central Africa, of course, happens to be both. And so those countries are fragile and have limited capacity almost by definition. Administration, their private sector have reasonably limited capacity. They need the private sector. They need private sector investment more than anyone. But the private sector will not go there, but by definition, the risk profile is too high. That's why finding and structuring these blending vehicles, getting bilateral donors, the European Union and others, to come alongside us to find this riskier part and help bring this private sector expertise and financing into these more risky environments, I think is something absolutely critical.
All right, Charles?
Thank you. Very quickly, I think just to address two questions, one on the guarantee and one on the capital markets point. I thank you for allowing me to address any misconception that the capital markets was an easy area to work in. My point was that project finance has its place, but a lot of the projects that we all are very proud of took several years to fund. And therefore, by path of least resistance, I mean, we need to get funding into African projects now. We can do that through capital markets. Kenya, I think, gives us a fantastic example of how, since 2012, we, with one or two partner banks, have been able to bring more than $2.4 billion of loan market funding to Kenyan government, which in turn is invested into infrastructure projects, which in turn is then taken out via long-term Eurobond issuances. I believe that, to Janet's point, dollars do have their place where dollars are generated by the projects, but of course, longer term, we need to concentrate on deepening the local currency capital markets. And to the point of guarantees, again, we have to cater towards the appetite which we think is available for funding in Africa. If that needs a 100% guarantee to bring Chinese liquidity, so be it. If that doesn't need 100, but we can use 50% on a staggered basis to bring European liquidity to particular countries or to particular multilaterals, so be it. By path of least resistance, I think we have to be practical in getting whatever funding for as longer term as possible on bankable assets that we can. Thank you.
So 3 things: local currency, guarantee, and fragile conflict. On local currency, I just want to remind everyone, because we're sitting in Asia, 20 years ago, there was this Asian financial crisis. Before the Asian financial crisis, Asia's development trajectory was very similar to Africa. We borrowed heavily in dollars. We relied on external investment. But Asia financial crisis taught us never again. So in this 20 years, Asia really focused on developing its domestic and regional capital market, therefore denominating its economy in its own currency, thereby building that resilience. So in Asian middle-income countries, just use corporate bond as a percentage of GDP as an indicator. Now you have China, India, the big countries, where corporate bond is 20-30% of GDP, all the way to Malaysia, where corporate bond is 100% of GDP, almost to the level of the United States. So much so that a South Korean company can easily go to Malaysia, issue a ringgit bond, swap back into Korean won, and get a efficiently funded local currency. And that is what Africa needs to do. What is the reality in Africa? Outside of South Africa, corporate bond as a percent of GDP in any of the other countries don't exceed 2%, well 2%. But in terms of low-hanging fruit, as Ibukun was asking, I certainly think Nigeria has all the market infrastructure. Kenya has all the market infrastructure. As a matter of fact, East Africa community and also Rwanda has done tremendous reform, and we are very happy that even in the Rwanda market, IC has been able to put our AAA bonds both on the onshore and offshore market. So I think really it is time for us to work together to move that 2% to 20%, from 20% to 50% to 100%. Just imagine how much funds can be efficiently recycled and denominated in local currency. On guarantee, I think the philosophy is that when you provide a full guarantee, you essentially transfer the risk to the guarantor. Our philosophy in IC is that we should provide just enough guarantee to make the project viable, to make that bond issuer credible to the market. And over time, that entity will become self-sustainable. So, and the third issue on fragile conflict, I think this is where you're absolutely correct, Minister, that we have to make extra effort to de-risk projects, infrastructure projects in fragile conflict. And therefore, in the latest IDA 18, IDA deputies and our board have endorsed a $2.5 billion window to de-risk IFC and MEGA finance or guaranteed project. This is very significant, and most of that funds will be going into infrastructure in fragile conflict and IDA countries. I think hopefully we can get it rolling very quickly after July 1st, and to demonstrate that even in the most challenging conditions, when you remove the political risk and non-financial risk, there are bankable, commercially viable projects there. Lastly, let me mention this, that is, not all infrastructure projects a private sector bankable. The last mile railroad is a public good. But because of a shortage of ODA, how can we prioritize so the ODA goes to education, to social, to the last mile social infrastructure or basic infrastructure that is needed but not commercially viable, but make sure every commercially viable project is done by the private sector, with us, the multilateral development banks, de-risking, making that project viable. I think that's what we have been working on. We call it Cascade in the World Bank Group. And hopefully with that, we can crowd in, using our billions, trillions of dollars and local currency financing to African infrastructure.
All right, thank you. Adesigo.
Yeah, let me take off from where Jindong ended. I think there are three types of infrastructure assets. There are basic infrastructure assets that are not commercially viable, and I think the public sector or the multilateral development banks should be the lead players for such infrastructure. Then you have at the other end large-scale, highly profitable infrastructure where you can get in first-tier investors. But then in the middle, you have what are marginally profitable infrastructure assets, and that's the sweet spot where institutions like us, at least the AFC and possibly the Africa 50, can play a major role. Just to address the issue that was raised on agriculture, bad infrastructure does lead or contribute to high cost of agriculture. One of the ways in which we're addressing that in AFC is actually to form platform vehicles. We're partnering, for example, in Gabon with the Gabonese government and Olam, one of the leading agricultural producers on the continent. And in that platform vehicle, we have infrastructure assets. We're actually helping to build two ports. One is a mineral port that would help to evacuate some of the agricultural produce that is being produced by Olam in the hinterland. One is a general port, which also would help to export, to aid the export of goods and services. So there are solutions that are being looked at that would help to alleviate some of the infrastructure bottlenecks that is contributing to the high cost of agricultural goods in Africa. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adesigo, and also thank you very much, Pierre, Janet, Jingdonghua, Sergey, Charles, and Alain. And a big round of applause to our panel, also to yourselves, ladies and gentlemen. In case you want to do any deals, please feel welcome before they all escape out the door. But I think this conversation has been very useful in trying to bring some of the answers to questions which all of us have had with regard to financing African infrastructure. Thank you so very much to all of you, and thank you to the panel. Good afternoon.